Hello, everyone. Nice to see you here. Welcome to the uncertain condition. When we started to assemble the program and doing research for the whole Transmediale conference, we were trying to deal with this notion of scale and from so many different angles. But there was something that, among other topics or themes or angles, there was something that was kind of like bothering us and we wanted to touch on and try to tackle. And this was the idea of uncertainty, of volatility. Because we didn't want to deal with that in a psychological way, of course. It didn't make any sense to us for Transmediale. We thought there was something more, and we had this feeling that something was building around that, some kind of political and aesthetical and intimate and geopolitical condition. We were not sure about how to deal with that. We felt that there were some computational logics and their specific temporalities, usually micro-temporalities, involved in all that. And these computational logics actually are around us, are through us, promising to predict all kinds of situations. From political elections, the choice of a new political leader, up to love matches. So these logics capture movements, capture affects, capture decision-making processes. They operate together with macroeconomic forces against geopolitical backdrops. They produce uncertain political conditions from which a range of very conflicting, potentially conflicting statements, positions, behaviors emerge, both in public and in private lives. In other words, uncertainty. Uncertainty is found everywhere. It permeates everywhere. Job markets, job routines, leisure routines, fluctuating energy prices that are somehow connected to some kind of events. Sometimes they are not. You don't really understand. Rents in our cities, confusing overload of news, the constant flow of micro incentives in our daily lives. They silently guide us and make decisions, or help us or force us to make decisions. So as a result, I was saying, this sense of instability is actually growing into a new political reality, and that it was something that we wanted to tackle. These logics of prediction mobilize uncertainty and risk in a specific ways. They alter our actions in the world. They narrow some political possibilities, some aesthetical possibilities, and foreclose some kind of futures. In this scenario, disorientation and structural violence even are rationalized as some sort of a need for preparation towards a constantly looming crisis. So we wanted to touch upon all of these things. We didn't know how to do it, so we approached our friends here, Bahar, Noorizadeh, David Capener, and Aris, Komporozos-Athanasiou, who in different ways were trying to make sense of some of these things. In very different ways, actually. That was something that we were really interested into, like having different angles, visions, approaches, and practices. David, I'm going to introduce you briefly. David Capener is an architect, a writer, and educator. His work explores the production of space in our computational and planetary computation age. In 2021, with a multidisciplinary group, Annex, he represented Ireland at the Venice Biennial with the work Entanglement, which was also part, by the way, of Transmediale 2022. He's editor and actually co-author of the book States of Entanglement, which explores implications of data production and use in the Irish landscape. David has a forthcoming chapter in the book, The Digital and Physical City, titled Good Game, Peace Out, which explores the implications of algorithmic image production techniques that operate below the threshold of human perception. He is currently working on the forthcoming book, Bernard Stiegler for Architects, which looks at how the production of space might be thought through the work of the philosopher of technology, Bernard Stiegler. He's also about to complete his PhD, congratulations, at Technical University Dublin, titled The Infrasomatic City, which explores the extent to which the right to the city is possible in our technological age, where bodies have become entangled with algorithmic technologies in ever more complex ways. Bahar Noorizadeh is an artist, writer, and filmmaker. Welcome. Her research examines the historical advance of speculative activity and its derivative politics in art, urban life, finance, and economics. Bahar is the founder of Weird Economies, an online art platform that traces economic imaginaries extraordinary to financial arrangements of our time, and that includes pedagogical tools, methodologies, activist strategies, workshops, and more. Her recent writing and video practices engage in Bahar own words with financial science fiction and weird literature to explore the weird temporalities of finance performed by the media and culture industries. Her work has appeared in several venues, festivals, biennials, among them German Pavilion of the Venice Architectural Biennial 2021, Tate Modern, This Art Platform, and her publications, essays appeared on eFlux Architecture, Journal of Visual Culture, and in several publications. And she's also currently a PhD candidate at Goldsmiths, University of London. And finally, well, we have with us today Aris Komporozos-Athanasiou. Welcome. Aris is a sociologist and writer. He's an associate professor at University College London, where he directs the BSc Sociology and leads the Sociology and Social Theory Research Group. Aris is the author of, frankly, I'm sorry I put myself in, but frankly amazing book called Speculative Communities, Living with Uncertainty in a Financialized World by the University of Chicago Press. His second book project, called Real Fake, An Intellectual History of Distortion, documents the historical role of market technologies in shaping our collective understandings of reality and truth. Aris has published in several mediums, some even journals like Boston Review, The Guardian, Los Angeles Review of Books, etc., etc. He's also a co-host of the Conspiracy Games and Counter Games podcast and an editor at the British Journal of Sociology. So, first of all, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. The conversation we are hoping to have today is going to be organized in basically 3 chapters, so to speak. These chapters are going to be kind of raw thematic blocks. But yeah, the first chapter is basically about what we decided to call everyday modes of speculation. This very tentative proposition seems to have at least 2 sides. David's research explores one side that is actually represented by the algorithmic processes that build images and space. The other side is probably represented by the work by Aris regarding your suggestion that there is something like a speculative turn that has happened in social, political, and even intimate life. So I would start rather with that, this idea of everyday modes of speculation. Aris or David?
Yeah, okay, I can try to make a start. So thanks for the invitation, first of all, and it's really lovely to be here with all of you today and with the 2 of you. And yeah, so I guess Bani offered us some very useful background to the themes that interest me in the book. I was told to hold it like this for a few seconds. So I suppose my own... There we go.
You're on TV now.
Yeah. So I guess you can see from the title, the book touches on various of the themes that Bani was just talking about. So uncertainty really is at the core of my preoccupation and my... In writing this book, I sort of wanted to tackle what I have considered and what many considered somewhat of something of a paradox, and that is how, although we are today faced, as Bani was saying, with increased levels of uncertainty throughout our day-to-day lives, social, intimate, political lives, we don't necessarily or always seem to attempt to avert it, to control it, to kind of take a hold of it and limit it. There is quite an interesting phenomenon whereby more and more people in different aspects of their lives seem to be rather endorsing at least aspects of that uncertainty. So why do that? Why delve into the depths of the unknown, immerse into the uncertain mode of existence, rather than, try to put a stop to it? So I know this first session is about the day-to-day life, the routine, the quotidian, the small scale, but maybe just very quickly I'll give an example from slightly broader scale, since scale is part of the theme, the overarching theme as well. What do I mean by endorsing uncertainty? The most obvious manifestation of that is in everyday politics, is in things like voting behavior, whereby we get the election of people like Trump and Modi and Bolsonaro and this brand of extreme right populism, which doesn't really offer clear solutions to our everyday problems, to our modes of insecurity, in social reproduction, in housing, in wages, and so on. But it seems to just speak to quite a chaotic future, and yet it is that chaotic, uncertain, and open-ended future that many of us seem to be attracted to. Things like Brexit and other events that I look at in the book, where folks are asked to decide on the future of, say, their country, and they opt for the not obviously more stable solution, but for the inherently unstable, are other such examples. But more to the point of everyday life, this is, in the book, I try to trace this behavior on various levels, and some of those are to do with our everyday engagements with virtual space, with what I call speculative technologies. And speculative technologies are none other than the various apps, social media, anything from our routine use of Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. I'm interested in image-heavy media more than text-based, simply because the visuality of they really offer very interesting windows into this chaotic moment, because just the pace of scrolling and the kind of imagery you get, you're flooded with, it tends to make for a very chaotic collage often. Also the way we fluctuate between different apps, and in the book I focus on things like astrology apps. I spent a lot of time on CoStar. I don't know how many of you are fans or have profiles. You can feel free to add me. And dating apps. And again, I also did a lot of ethnography on dating apps. And the point, what fascinates me about, and I actually examined those together. I think that digital astrology and dating apps have share a fascinating kind of shared like ground, common ground. And that is the way in which they do not seem to offer us any stable solutions, right? I mean, that's an established critique. Dating apps, it's, you know, proven that they're not the route to the conventional romantic kind of narrative tale. And of course, astrology doesn't really predict the future. You know, we don't turn to astrology to find the real answers about what's going to happen to us. Well, maybe some of us do, but there seems to be also something else going on while we pursue these kind of, in our romantic and social pursuits through those kind of apps. I should say also that if you know Coaster, it's quite a social and social-oriented app because a lot of it relies on building a network, messaging, checking compatibility across different levels according to the star movements and so on. So why then? You know, why we're attracted? And my thesis here is that we are actually attracted by uncertainty itself. And the reason why we find refuge to these apps is not because of their stable answers, but because they reflect back to us the very uncertain condition that we find ourselves in. And they do so with gusto and with humor and with they do so in a way that makes that uncertainty feel like a cozy space within which to we experience our lives. So I suppose, yeah, maybe we'll have the chance to unpack this a bit more, but maybe in closing this little intro, I should say that this kind of argument is also developed against a very prominent critique that we're all familiar with, which has to do with the sort of surveillance state and the role of those technologies in, and perhaps David will speak a little bit on that, the way in which, you know, we are users who contribute ample data to those kind of big brother surveillance data centers who then go on to manipulate our behaviors towards producing more data, and the data feeds to profit. Security concerns are obvious. Now, I'm not challenging that narrative. I think that very much, of course, exists, and surveillance capitalism is very real. But I think that critics of surveillance capitalism often tend to assume too much of a passive audience. Like, we're all often seen as kind of lost and adrift and isolated and fragmented. And my point in the book and my argument and my belief actually is that that's too dark a picture and not quite as representative. It misses something of the richness and of the active engagement that folks have with those apps. So my whole point, and hence speculative communities, is that we're not that entirely withdrawn, fragmented, isolated subject, modern subject of digital surveillance capitalism. At least we're not only that. We are an inherently social but speculative subject, right? So we do seek connections. Yes, we endorse uncertainty, but we want to do this collectively. So for me, that's a key turn in this way in which we speculate in our everyday lives through those kind of media. And yeah, I guess that's the kind of argument that I try to make across those levels. But yeah, maybe I'll stop for now.
Yeah. David, I think your take on this is slightly different, right? It like observes like a different scale of things, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like Aris, I'm interested in speculation. I'm interested in how that functions in everyday life. But as an architect, I'm interested in space. I'm interested in the city. I'm less interested in what the question of what architecture is or what a building is or what a city is. I'm interested in what can a city do, what can space do. So the possibilities of space. I'm particularly interested in public space and the production of public space. And I come from the kind of position that public space doesn't exist, it's produced, it's performed. And then to what extent are these technologies of speculation curtailing the performance of public space, the right to be in public space, the right to appear, the right to be seen, or the right to see. And I think those things, through the role that images play in a similar, but I guess a bit of a different way. And I come from a position I don't think is, might not be new to you, but the position is that images don't just represent the world, they don't just tell us something about the world, they produce the world. Our world is produced and mediated through images. That then leads me to a kind of second position, which is, you'll have to excuse me, I've been losing my voice over the past few weeks. Yeah, that'd be good. That technological revolutions are also phenomenological revolutions. That as technologies change and advance, the way we perceive the world and the way we are perceived changes. And then as an architect, I like to think those things through what we know as infrastructure. So infra, as in infrared, meaning below the surface, and structure, we know what that means. But I also want to begin to think infrastructures in a new way. So the technologies of planetary computation, digital planetary computation, entangle our bodies in new ways with the infrastructures that facilitate everyday life in the city. And I have recently been thinking those things through three processes that kind of form the backbone of the internet. And those are latency, bandwidth, and reliability. And when you think about those three things, I also think about Mortal Kombat. And also what happens remarkably when you pick up an iPhone to take a photograph, but we'll get to that in a minute. Latency, bandwidth, and reliability, which is immediately a question of volatility, and immediately a question of instability, because behind this thin veneer of the multiplicity of kind of high-resolution screens through which we live our lives, through which the world is represented to us, lies an entanglement of material processes, of material extraction, of often exploitative labor practices, these things that I call supply chains of perception. In terms of those three backbone processes behind the internet, the one that I'm really interested in is latency. So how long does a packet of data take to get from A to B? That's the simple kind of definition of latency, right? You send a text, you send it to someone in England, how long does it take to get there, right? So latency then for me, particularly when we're thinking about images, is a question of how does an image handle uncertainty, right? How does an image deal with volatility in networks? So when there's a spike in latency, what processes now are put in place to help manage that instability and volatility? So I like to think that through one single frame of the game Mortal Kombat. So that frame takes place over 16 milliseconds, okay? And in that 16 milliseconds, if you're playing Mortal Kombat and you're playing it online with someone around the other side of the world, in that 16 milliseconds, a lot happens. Players are asked for inputs, the network is checked for new information, AI might be run to run CPU players, each character is animated, the current game state is assessed, the game state is recorded, who's getting hit, what move they've just made, etc., 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 okay? So if you're playing in Berlin and you're competing against someone in Dublin, there's a time distance. It takes time for a frame to travel. Probably about 3 frames, actually, in time to travel. So that's fine if latency is good and 3 frames are traveling back and forth and there's no delay, the game continues and you don't notice any difference. What happens if there's a spike in latency? This is the problem. So most online fighting games kind of run on a 3-frame delay, okay? So you wouldn't notice that because each frame is 16 milliseconds, all right? If the spike in latency goes beyond 3 frames, the game crashes, all right? Which happens a lot in my house because my son plays online games and you can hear him screaming, and I'm having to teach him not to use bad language because he's not old enough yet. However, there's an algorithm called Good Game Peace Out that is deployed in a number of online fighting games. And this algorithm, in short, predicts the player's next move. And if there is a spike in latency and your move doesn't reach your opponent in Dublin, for example, then the predictive move will kick in. Okay, so how does this work? This works that the whole game is serialized, the whole game is recorded, and if the prediction is right, which kind of often it is. I mean, fighting games are pretty simple. If you're holding back like that, you're going to punch someone. You're probably not going to jump in the air. If you're up in the air, you're probably going to come down, okay? But if the prediction is wrong, then the game rolls back. It's called rollback netcode, okay? So it rolls back. You wouldn't see this because it happens so quickly. And it rolls back to the move that was correct. And then it replays the game with the correct move. Now, for this to happen, the whole game must be archived in real time, okay? And it's archived as image code, and then it's rendered as code image. So actually, remarkably, the game could continue without any of the code being rendered. So for computer graphics, and this is part of the kind of whole history of computer graphics, each object must be described in advance if it's going to be rendered visible, okay? So this is remarkably different to, say, taking a photograph with a traditional camera, right? So, and it's that difference between code image and image code. In between those two processes, the process of rendering, that a remarkable series of processes can take place. And that's the manipulation of the image, automated image production. So, back to Mortal Kombat. Importantly, when the game rolls back to a frame where a prediction error was made, the image on the screen is a simulation. It's a simulation of the past, okay, that's then rendered in the present. And all this happens below the threshold of human consciousness, okay? So, we have a situation whereby algorithmic image production is mediating the present in ways that are outside the bounds of human consciousness, and in ways that produce new strange kinds of temporalities that we don't often perceive. And these processes are often not revealed to us. Well, they are revealed to us, but when they break down. So it's that feeling that you get at the end of the film in the cinema when the lights come on, right? Yeah? And you realize, oh, you're scrolling through Instagram, and suddenly you're broken out of that because the kids are whatever, you know? And it's like, oh, shit, I was caught up in what felt like a very different kind of temporality, okay? So when that break happens, and it does sometimes in games like this, it will glitch, and you will realize that behind this kind of smooth veneer of image production, there are a multiplicity of algorithmic processes that are taking place to make this happen. These microtemporal misfirings reveal that we are becoming increasingly caught up in processes of the production of temporality, yet we're actually totally aware that any of these things are happening. So, the kind of basis of my work is that we now live in a remarkable crisis of visibility and a crisis of representation, okay? Every technological advance produces new ways of seeing. Every technological advance produces new crises of representation. It's a story you can trace all the way back to Alberti's velo in the Renaissance and Renaissance perspective, okay? However, this is now happening below the threshold of human perception. So the questions I want to ask is, what does that mean if, as I say, images don't just represent the world, they produce the world? How is space being produced?
Wow. I mean, this sets the stage for starting to think in terms of speculation or speculative technologies in a different way, because that we see there's this complex machinery that is, in this case, building images, and it's operating, it's acting on the world, and it's building the world. And so this happens, you realize when a glitch happens, or when a Netflix series is slightly delayed, is catching up, but it's happening all the time. Even in your camera, when you're taking a picture, you're not really taking a picture. There's a very complex algorithmic process. And it's all focused and put into motion just with this idea of managing latency, or managing confusion, and sometimes even instrumentalizing confusion. At the end of this conversation, we want to reach a point when we will be talking about speculation, of course, not in a strictly financial sense. We want to arrive at some point where we are going to talk about counter speculations. We will have some time to discuss about this. But first, I guess we need to probably build up the framework, even historical framework, that made all of this possible. materially, but also conceptually and culturally. So that's what the second part of our conversation is going to be about. I understand that both you, Bahar, and Aris have been dealt with this idea of speculation and speculative technologies, and like trying to unpack them, but also like backtracking them into the idea of calculation. Why calculation at some point became really important in different historical and economical contexts. Maybe it could be interesting to bring it up now. But Bahar, I know you've been working a lot on these topics from a very specific angle, which might not be the same as Aris, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, also Bani and everyone at Transmediale. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation, I feel, between the three of us, because we each bring a different angle to this, conversation around speculation and uncertainty. But I can maybe try to give a redux version of how, as an artist, my practice evolved to think about speculation more seriously. So in 2018, I made this film called After Scarcity, which was essentially trying to address the questions around governance on a large scale, which came about in the aftermath of 2008 financial crisis. People started to look back at these utopian socialist projects of something that would be alternative to destructive financialization or aggressive financialization and speculation. And some of these models were found in, histories of Soviet Union cybernetics project or the Chilean cybernetics projects. So yeah, essentially, something that's discussed in the film is this very famous economic debate called the socialist calculation problem in the 20th century. Between what's kind of like categorically called the socialist camp and or the market socialists and the socialist camp and the neoliberals. And so the kind of provocation that neoliberals were addressing the socialists with was that you can't basically regulate or govern, this massive amount of data that's needed to be extracted, processed, mobilized, archived, for the sake of planning that kind of scale. Whereas the market does that seamlessly, and that's due to, and this is like before the, invention of computers, obviously, but they're kind of like thinking about the market as a form of computer before the invention of computers, because it does that kind of calculation automatically with no need for maintenance, manhandling. Like it's just due to, the technology of pricing and, the mere fact of competition, it does that kind of calculation. And so when the computers actually became a thing, you can imagine that's when the socialists were like, see, we can, now we can calculate. And, this is going to change the game. So obviously those projects didn't happen. But the ghost of these socialist projects kind of lived on in platform capitalism as we know it now. And these are the conversations that were happening around 2008 that, what's the kind of capacity, computational capacity that we have with Amazon, Walmart, that kind of infrastructure can actually handle that kind of planning. It just needs to be mobilized differently. So this is what I was addressing with After Scarcity, but this is kind of old research. Then I started my PhD, and there was a shift in, trying to think about histories of the market and histories of neoliberalism, more seriously digging into that literature. And I feel there's a sort of, when you look deeper into that, there's a sort of misunderstanding of reducing the entire conversation around the efficiency problem. I feel like this is kind of the core of what we are trying to get at. It's as if the debates on both sides were only around this problematic of efficiency. Whereas, then I started reading Hayek's work, a bit more deeply, one of the progenitors of the market theories and neoliberal theory. And closer to the end of his career, like his later writings, this character that he's trying to portray of the market starts to get more and more esoteric. And there's this kind of metaphysical dimension that starts to appear more and more. Like there's a point that he quite literally says, it's not that the market, organizes knowledge, it organizes the unknown. Like it has the capacity to organize the unknown. And I think this is really necessary to understand the neoliberal condition as not just something that's based on, the calculation and the informatic problem. Like it's really a problem of knowledge. So with that very long, historical introduction, then I started to think about what is this speculative condition, which Aris talked about a bit. Which I'm using, I'm not like a professional theorist, so I read different people who've been talking about this stuff. One of them is Michel Feher, specifically, which I feel like Aris also has something to say about, in response to Feher's work. But I think what's important with Feher's work is that he shifts the grounds of talking about speculation to discuss how can we engage with speculation in practice. So trying to forge, he would call it like activist strategies, financial activism against speculation. So it's no more, this kind of abstract conversation in academic fields, but really trying to figure out how do we actually counter how speculation is forming our environments. And so very specifically, he's saying, what's shifted in this environment is that kind of dynamic of employer-employee is no more in place, and now we have a third figure, which is the figure of the shareholder and the bondholder, which is, controlling the employer now. So the older school kind of labor activism strategies of sabotage have to come to terms with how do you approach that, that different dynamic of power that's coming from the shareholder side. And so, finally, there's actually a term called financial activism that's used by, hedge fund crowd. And there's such a thing called activist hedge funds. That's quite literally, people who are professional shareholders who sit on, certain boards. So instead of actually, picking companies for their long-term growth and kind of wait patiently for their, for the returns, they discover inefficiencies in companies and then get involved with the management and the board, and they use harassment as a strategy, constant harassment of managers to raise the value of their shares. And this person, Dan Loeb, is kind of known, he's a sort of a rock star of Wall Street. He's the manager of Third Point. And he's known for these widely mediatized campaigns in Yahoo, Dow Chemical, and Sotheby's. And yeah, so very briefly, again, through my readings, there are two people who I would just address because we are talking about how to, think about speculation as an activist strategy. Again, Feher himself has some ideas on how to incorporate rating agencies and think about, credit as the kind of the new area where our efforts should be addressed at. So this idea of raising the credit worthiness of the discredited through reputation strikes, or which again speaks to social media maybe campaigns. Like he brings up BLM and the different waves of Me Too that happened across the planet as examples of they're not just working on that level of representation to name it as an old kind of leftist model would see, but they understand how representation is generating the kind of credit worthiness that is quite literally changing environments. So he says in this quote, far from sacrificing substance to symbolism or concentrating on symptoms to the detriment of structural inequalities, these movements reckon with the fact that the allocation of moral, social, and financial credit has become the decisive stake of social struggles. And then the second person that I engage with, it's not something that an artist can pick up on very immediately or directly, is the philosopher and historian Robert Meister, and his ideas are more kind of like macro scale state intervention on picking up on option theory, which is something that derives from finance. And basically, so Meister's background, he's been thinking about the question of questions of reparative and historical justice and redress in financial times. And basically, what he's saying is that historical injustice is accumulated in the forms of wealth in financial markets, massive wealth in financial markets. So if you want to address historical justice, you have to deal with that level of, imagination of how to take that, turn that around. And so he's basically saying that since the option of revolution is postponed, it's a bit of an allegorical game here too, but he means it literally. Like that postponement in the revolutionary option allows the states to ask for a premium or to put a price on the option of revolution to financial institutions when they bail them out during moments of crisis. And this very great formulation is finance is a technology to manufacture alternatives to illiquidity, same as democracy is a technology to manufacture alternatives to revolution. So I don't know how much time I have, but I can come back to practice part.
Later, yeah.
Should I come back to this later?
Later.
Okay.
Because you've been opening up so many, fronts, and I feel we have a sense of how complex is this idea of speculation when it spills over from finance over to society, and even more complex when we are trying to build something like an open-ended form of speculation for some reason that is against these extreme calculation processes or microtemporal calculation processes. And we also sense, as you were talking about the socialist cybernetics and socialist calculation dilemma, this might have very deep roots into our culture, including finance as a cultural object. So I'd like to actually ask Aris, because I reckon you are have a slightly different approach regarding this. It might be useful maybe to hear from you a little bit, both about, if you want, if you have time, I don't know, about the cultural roots of this in the history of finance. But also I would like to ask you something before getting into the third and last chapter of our conversation about some sort of regressive and also some kind of progressive modes of speculation in the current times.
Yeah, and there was just so much there in what Bahar was saying. I would love to kind of engage with. So let's see how to do this. I think maybe just to start with a problem of calculation, and from the perspective of finance and in the kind of history of finance that I try to sketch out in my work, I sort of the point I make is that unlike what we often think, maybe intuitively, of markets and finance as proponents or fans of stability, and so we tend to think of finance as also like today, like a highly technologized, very kind of machinistic, like predictive, calculative apparatus, like kind of seeking opportunity in deploying all these modes of data processing, big data these days, mimetic data, to kind of produce like models that work to calculate and seek profit opportunities, right? That's the kind of image we have of finance. And historically, of course, finance is like mathematics, right? I mean, inevitably we think of finance as something that kind of just controls, produces representations, and then applies them, models, to make profit. So I want to kind of shake up that notion that we have of finance and make the point that, in fact, there is another side to finance, expressed through speculation, that is not that different from the modes of speculation that we intuitively understand in other realms of life, like speculation in philosophy, speculation in religion, in like these kind of cosmologies of different types, speculation in science and innovation. There is something about speculation that is inherently open-ended, right? I mean, and of course, with finance, there's something quite fascinating, which has to do with how finance operates in relation to uncertainty. And so it's often and historically, not just at the present moment, finance's capacity to produce profitable opportunities to harness opportunities for profit, lie in its capacity to navigate and, when needed, cultivate uncertainty. And so this image, there's a war, there is a crisis event, there is a public health crisis, markets go all over the place because they're upset, they don't like uncertainty. That is grossly unrepresentative of how markets think. Markets actually see fantastic opportunities for profit in that very uncertainty that we claim to think, it's destabilizing for them. So there is a lot of fascinating history around theoretical economics and how there's different kinds of uncertainty, and there is this what we call Knightian uncertainty from Frank Knight, who wrote economist who was writing in the early 20th century, to capture precisely radical uncertainty. That is, and to come to the point of calculation, incalculable uncertainty. Though we're surrounded by this kind of notion that uncertainty can in some ways be controlled, radical uncertainty captures the acceptance of the unknown, the incalculable, the unpredictable. And finance thrives in that. So tools like derivative products, futures, options, these are all products that operate on some level of detached reality from the material trading of goods that are palpable, and they're based on the exchange of promises and of broken promises. Often the main volume of trading in financial markets today has to do precisely with these derivative products, which are often seek explicitly to profit from the movement of prices, right? And so it's not about whether, in our minds, opportunities lie in investing, and then the price will go up, you win, the price goes down as you lose. It's about, it doesn't matter whether the price goes up and down on a product. A derivative can be there to give you profit. And then there are products like represented that specifically are developed around things like volatility. So the higher the volatility, there's something called the fear index, the volatility index in the Chicago Board of Trade. It's an index that basically tracks levels of uncertainty, the feeling of the market about how uncertain things might be in the future. And then there are derivative products that are based on that volatility index. So people bet on the volatility of imagined volatility, right? Nothing to do with material goods, nothing to do with price going up or down, all about how big the uncertainty is likely to be. They love uncertainty. That's the profitable stuff. And that's not particularly close-minded or mechanistic and deterministic, right? It's a dive into the unknown of the future, and a very profitable dive indeed. Extremely pernicious in the sense of the impact it has on all of us, with the financialization of everyday life and the increase of inequality of all sorts, but nonetheless, it's open. There is an openness that is often missed in accounts of finance. So I want you to keep that in mind, because that openness takes all sorts of fascinating ways in the history of finance. And so there are things like financial astrology that have a history of a good couple of hundred of years in at least. And there are points in time where financial traders in the Wall Street and the big exchanges are avid readers of big financial astrologers like Evangeline Adams, who is a mythical figure in American finance just around the time of the Great Depression in the 1920s. So almanacs, tarot card reading, these kind of weird alternative spiritual cosmologies are actually go hand in hand with financial speculation and financialized views of the future. They're not words that are insulated from each other. They're very enmeshed, very entangled. So actually, my example of co-star and digital astrology isn't just only metaphorically relevant to how finance works. It's actually quite closely. I mean, there are some fascinating arguments that claim, look, financial speculation is a mode of astrology, and so a very profitable one. So that's all to say there are a few other aspects there in speculation that have to do with things like imagination. That really interests me. That is the capacity to produce representations, images, worlds, myths that are very concretely real. They're not just imagined in the fantastical sense, in the dreamy, escapist sense, but have material impact on our lives. Finance very much does that. So, yeah. And,
No, go ahead.
No, and then I guess maybe on the theme of like the politics of that and the regressive versus progressive.
Exactly.
So I want you to consider of two key sides of speculation based on what I've described so far. One is the openness. Okay, I think I've established it more or less, I hope. But there is also some dialectical kind of counterforce to that openness, which is the security that one needs in order to be able to face the unknown in the eye and speculate. So you need to come from a position of relative security. So you need some stability, some safety net from which to kind of pivot and do those speculations. And so obviously financiers in the Chicago Board of Trade or on Wall Street, they have the huge material resources to do so. The many don't. What do the many have? What do the everyday people? What do the excluded or the marginalized, the dispossessed? What do they have? What kind of security do they have in order to look at the uncertainty in the eye and speculate on its openness and unknowability? So I think there are modes of symbolic insurance or symbolic security that folks often seek. And if we apply that double kind of force of speculation on contemporary politics, what we often see with things like right-wing populism, for instance, like the nationalist currents of populist politics, or even things like conspiracy theories and conspiracy movements like QAnon and the like, isn't just merely a regressive pursuit of security and stability and a fabled past. That is part of the story, but that's only the security side. There is also the openness. And I think that's, again, often missed in our accounts of something like Trumpism or Brexiteers or QAnon conspiracists. We tend to discount their approach to the future at a distance, or assuming that it's merely past-oriented. Now, I think its success often, and its attraction, lies in the fact that it mobilizes both security and openness. And there's something about the capacity of people like obscene and disgusting figures like Trump and all the Brexiteers and this kind of crowd to not inspire in the traditional sense, but to to not do the easy broken promise of stability, to play and cynically play with the openness of the future. So, I mean, remember Trump's thing of like trade wars and, it's a governed by chaos principle. It's a very important one. So the regressives are very good in that game, in the game of sowing confusion, disorientation, because that is the social field. So the political field that they mobilize maps onto that social field of confusion and uncertainty. So then I guess what are the answers? And as you might have kind of guessed, I tend to, I don't want to say I'm an optimist, but I want to see, I'm always curious about the opportunities that are kind of coming from the bottom up, about how do folks, when pushed in those corners of uncertainty, is it all doom and gloom? Is it only Trump and conspiracy and QAnon? I mean, is that the only way that we respond to uncertainty? And I think it isn't, and I think that what I call in my work counter speculation can be those more progressive weaponizations of uncertainty that endorse the openness of an unknown future, whilst cultivating modes of security, closeness, that are not regressive, that rely, for example, on mutual care, on mutual responsibility, on the collectivization of our uncertain condition. And these are not only abstract, they exist, and it's a kind of politics that doesn't always look like it's political, and I'm interested in that. It's the spaces, it operates on the virtual, across the virtual and the physical. In my work, I look, for example, at fandom communities and like K-pop fans and how they have created very interesting political spaces that precisely aim to create disorientation and confusion, and that is actually a political strategy of sabotage. But there is a sense of community and of support and mutuality that is very interesting and is not about, the nationalist security of the conspiracists, for example. There are many, but there are also, maybe I can close, there are also more traditional, conventional political spaces where we see this more progressive, counter-speculative spirit emerging. And in this work, in this book, I look at things like what happened in Greece in 2015, when the Greek people were asked to vote in a referendum about the terms of austerity that was kind of imposed by the forces of the European Union, the World Bank, and so on, the IMF, sorry. And there was a binary option that Greek people were presented with: yes to austerity and regulation and tightening the belt further, and obviously the catastrophic implications for their everyday lives that this would have had, and the no vote, which would have stand for what no one really knew, maybe exit from the euro, exit from the European Union, but chaos mainly, especially as it was represented in the media and the public discourse. And then overwhelmingly, people voted for that no. They voted for chaos. They voted for uncertainty. But there was something in the way in which that uncertain moment had generated connections and a shared sense of togetherness, that we are adrift, that we are uncertain, but that we are adrift in a collective way. We are adrift together. And there's something extremely powerful in that, and there's all sorts of things at the time written about how, obviously, the movement of the indignados, the version in Greece, and the kind of Occupy movement spills over to what was going on the ground. But it is, I think, that dual lens of a speculative, a political kind of counter-speculation that was at play very powerfully on an instance like that. And and then maybe finally, just to close, to speak to that moment of temporality that both David and Bahar have touched on. Like, what does this immersion in the present look like? I mean, we often hear this critique that we are very distracted. Like, we are on our phones. My students are always like on their phones, and so supposedly you don't grasp what's happening around you. So we are disconnected from reality. We're disconnected from the present moment, and that's linked to being passively kind of apolitical. We're numbed by our immersion. But I actually do see another side to this, and that is that we are attuned to the present. We are attuned to the uncertainty of the moment. And I think that attunement has a collective quality to it. You know, even dating, I was mentioning earlier, the dating app, you know, this image of this depressing kind of swiping and, you know, like immersion in the present of swiping. That's just like, you know, it is this. But is that all there is? I mean, and I think that there is a kind of collective imaginary that is generated through something even as seemingly lonely and isolated as the swipe that does connect us on some level. And I'm interested in not just dismissing it as withdrawal from the moment. It's just a different engagement with the moment, right? And there are different scales of this, and I think there is an interesting politics of counter-speculation that can be cultivated. That, yeah, I mean, I'm just hoping that we can all explore together. I have no answers there, but I'm very curious about these modes of counter-speculation.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give voice and space to them.
Yeah, that's interesting. David and then Bahar, do you see that your work, your research, your observations in relation to, you know, reclaiming the right to the city, for instance, and other models and practices that you were exploring within the Weird Economist platform, for instance, do you think they may respond in some way to this? Are they somehow related to this idea of, you know, reclaiming a different kind of speculation?
Yeah, I mean, having spent a lot of time on weirdeconomies.com, I'd like to hear more about that, because I think the question probably from the question raised from what all three of us have said is, well, so what? And what gives? And I think there are some really interesting discussions on there that contribute to that conversation. So, I mean, over to you.
Yeah, so just Weird Economies, I mean, I'm continuing from pretty much where I left off, was this attempt to try to think more generatively about speculation and speculative conscious accounts of social relations that we call, you know, economies. And there are many things going on. I think the nature of the project is the, you know, chaoticness. Like, I can't really sum it up. It just turns into like different diagrams. But one thing we are trying to do is to bring, you know, along the conceptual turning or to highlight money and bring money into the foreground and think about ways of experimenting with these flows of reputation, investment, interest, appreciation. So really kind of like have those questions in mind of, you know, what's these kinds of entanglements that the project has in the world. And part of it is, you know, there are certain experiments with self-funding the project, which, you know, they turned into like study groups or workshops. But the one aspect that I would like to talk about now more is this methodology that within the workshops and a kind of like pedagogic methodology that very organically like evolved out of the project as, you know, I or like certain members of the group were invited to discuss the project in different locations. And something that came very kind of like organically came out of it was, you know, LARPing as like usually the formats of the workshops. The format of the workshops would be a series of discussions grounding, you know, the debates on financialization, trying to think about financialization in these certain locations, and then like kind of building up towards speculative exercises in the form of LARP, live action role-playing game. Yeah. I just assume the transmedia crowd probably know that. I don't know if you can see this. It's very tiny, but like this is just one example of, you know, one of these LARPs that we conducted in Alexandria in Egypt over this 2-week workshop that, you know, was run in an art institution with artist Asam Hendawi. So we kind of like turned it into this crash course on theories of financialization, and alongside it, we are, looking into close studies of like these new city building projects in Egypt that's running rampant, and kind of the dynamics of, how they're funded, who are the shareholders, bondholders of these projects, which are mainly the Gulf states. But it's a very kind of particular combination of state military, complete like new cities fabricated in the desert, basically. And so we looked into this area of El Max. We kind of made it this fishing area as our site for doing this speculative exercise, and we basically try to locate, all the agents and actors who have like a type of interest, and like interest again broadly in any sense. It could be the fish, the fisherman, the Gulf states, the military state, and try to kind of like map out these like networks of interest, and give roles to them. Some of them were ideological roles, like anarchist, feminist, even like accelerationist. Which, you'd be surprised, but once you play the game with, I'm also Iranian, like when you play this game in different locations, you see that, they might be more popular, like even with anarchists, they would agree that maybe we need good tourism, in this area as a step towards something. So yeah, but like, you also realize that the ideological categories don't work, and then it just, the rules of the game starts to change, and the game, the game plan changes. The anarchist Capener, they quite literally subverted the electoral system and kind of turned it into a common-based system. That's him. Yeah, and then ultimately just turned into people designing their own characters. Yeah, and then just to finish maybe very quickly, like what we're doing right now in London, we're working with this community in Tottenham, Grow Tottenham, homegrown. And if you're familiar with London's, kind of waves of gentrification, Tottenham is one of the most racialized, like gentrified areas in London. And these people have been evicted out of this Saturday school program they had with youth in that area. So we are working with them, and they're actually friends of ours. So, there's a friendship going on in the context, which is quite important. It's this project called the School for Regeneration, and the plan is, again, like we have like 4 sessions of discussing, like kind of designing a syllabus to discuss financialization of London in particular that is, accessible for the youth, for a teenager crowd, and have those children participate in the sessions. And then there's a LARP design with Ruth Catlow, and someone who's very good with, city policy in London, and he's been thinking about how to buy back land for these communities. His idea of like privatizing for the sake of communities, which is also quite controversial, but interesting way of thinking about it. So we're designing a LARP that's also, playable by the youth.
You are designing this LARP at the moment.
With Ruth Catlow and with people at Homegrown, like the.
Do you know when you're gonna like actually play?
Yeah, so the plan is for May now. So, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Keep us posted. We want to know. Now, LARPs are actually interesting because they are replicable. They work with instructions. So what you're doing in London might be done in Dublin, in Athens, in Barcelona, and Berlin, right? So that's a very, in my opinion, a very valuable experiment.
Mm. But definitely with, variations. I think that's kind of what's, because that's kind of the experience that we gain, because we tried, we did the LARP in Beirut within another workshop, Alexandria, but each of them are very particular to how financialization is historically, working in those locations. Like Lebanon's case is like a massive banking crisis on a, service industry. like the entire economy is, services. There is no industry. And that's quite different from how it works in Egypt. So you kind of have different actors and different interests involved. Again, yeah, that's it.
Anyone wants to add anything, David?
I'm happy to move to questions if you.
No, we can do both.
We can do both. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that is kind of a response to a lot of the things I think about in terms of the right to the city and how the right to the city might be performed. So I'm not going to repeat that actually because you kind of articulated that in that example. So yeah.
So let's.
Can I just,
Aris,
just very quickly?
But be ready. Sorry, be ready. Now is the time for questions.
Yeah, no,
comments even.
Just a very quick comment on. I think this is fascinating, Bahar, and there's something that I think is really interesting in the principle of like in this LARPing as a method, and there's something about because if we think about to link it to to regressive speculations and like something like the world of conspiracy theories, a lot of their success is they're also world-making machines. They create mythical kind of realities, and participants kind of have to find the truth in that mythical universe. And there's a gamifying, the game aspect quality to that. So, which is part of the appeal, right? They're fun. There's something about that is so. It's fascinating to see that logic of like game and the pleasure that one derives out of that mobilized for progressive purposes. It can be extremely powerful and community building as well.
Exactly. Some people have studied QAnon as an example of LARPing, large-scale LARPing, which is kind of disturbing if you think about it, but kind of appropriate in a way, and community building in a probably a little bit sick way, but still.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of gamification is interesting, right? Because it's kind of used both ways, I mean, you probably know the story of Pokemon Go and the kind of history of how that developed from a game called Ingress and how that was used to develop Google Maps, and then how Pokemon Go was designed to maneuver people around the city in certain ways, and that there were incentives to go to certain places. Therefore, people were forced to go, well, not forced to go, but were incentivized to go through this process of gamification. And to then see that used in a positive way is kind of interesting because it speaks to a kind of interesting way of thinking about our technological epoch, which I was reminded of this morning when I woke up with a really big hangover because I drunk too much yesterday and went to the pharmacist and brought some paracetamol. And if I take 2 paracetamol, that's fine. If I take 5 at once, it's probably not fine because paracetamol is both the poison and the cure. And our technological epoch is both the poison and the cure. And Bernard Stiegler calls that the pharmacon. And that's a kind of story as old as philosophy itself. You go all the way back to Plato and the Sophists. They were having a fight over writing. Will writing be detrimental to memory? Plato said yes, the Sophists said no. And that's the story of technology. We must think these things through pharmacologically, sorry to use a big word, and within that find the therapeutics. And the reason why I wrap some conceptual theory around that is because that there is acting pharmacologically and finding the therapeutics, which is a right to the city, which is a right to the de-neoliberalization of areas of the city like Tottenham.
Oh, thanks for that. Let's see if anyone wants to jump in.
This links our work very. I think what you said there about the pharmacon, that principle of kind of immanence, like like working from within. I think that probably links our work amongst the three of us very nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. One here. Okay.
Just to follow up on the gamification of Q and on, one of the indicators that you may be right is the fact that when one guy went to rescue the children that were supposed to have been kidnapped by Hillary Clinton and put in the pizza basement, and he was he went fully armed, but he was stopped by the FBI. But it was interesting because he was the only single person who set out to rescue those children. So of all the hundreds of thousands of followers of Q, why was there only one person to go to try and enact that rescue? And one might speculate that the reason is that people didn't really believe it, but they really like playing the game of, don't want to call it a conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy without a theory, in fact, but certainly it was an indication that it is more likely to be gamification than the belief that there were really children being hidden in the basement.
Hi. So we briefly talked about AI, but I think that type of technology, machine learning, neural networks, whatever you want to call it, deals very much with like prediction and trying to sort of limit uncertainty. But at the same time, there's like a lot of uncertainty in it. Personally, I work a lot with like gender recognition algorithms, or as I like to call them, gender stereotype recognition algorithms. And they work with like binary gender, so they only have like male and female. But at the same time, a lot of them also give you like a percentage. So there's like a spectrum inside the binary, which is very interesting. But if you ask like a machine learning engineer, they would probably say, well, that's our prediction. That's our that's how certain we are that this is the correct gender. So maybe I would just hear like, what do you think about the role of machine learning neural networks within this realm of uncertainty prediction?
Do you want us to take a few questions or to...
Well, if there's a third one, maybe we can actually have a round. Is that a question? Yeah, I can see you actually. Over there, last row. Yeah, we can take like these three ones, and then you can actually respond to them.
Sorry I missed the start, but I was really fascinated by your discussion, and it's very much things that I'm thinking about also. So I was interested in two things possibly related. So the one thing that you were mentioning in the counter speculation was the fact that the distribution of access, or the distribution of possibilities to engage in the speculative, the uncertain, is so unequally distributed. So I was wondering, and that's probably also relating to the LARPing and the kind of pedagogies that you were talking about. To what extent do you think education is a path to other kinds of distribution of that access to navigating risks and speculating in a way that brings us somewhere or brings people forward, and to what extent you think this is mostly a matter of capital distribution? And if we're talking about education, what pathways do you see? What do we need to learn? What do communities, what can we share? I mean, you gave this beautiful, beautiful example of the lab and the role play. I think it's so inspiring, and I'm definitely going to use it in teaching with my students, so thank you. But I'm interested if you have any more ideas.
Okay, feel free to respond to the three question comments. First one, gamification and or belief, AI, prediction, also with an interesting topic on gender, which is really important, and then education. Pick it up as you wish. It's your job.
I think your question's really interesting. All three questions are interesting. Yours, however, is particularly interesting because it reminds us that those kind of micro-temporal processes of algorithmic calculation are deeply political spaces. They're deeply ethical spaces, right? And you alluded to, I guess, what a computer scientist would call weighting, right? I mean, in terms of the binary opposition, like a classic, an old school algorithm, 1 + 1 = 2 or whatever, you know, but actually a neural network with multiple pathways and multiple weightings immediately throws up the question about, well, why that weighting, or why that pathway, or what options are possible, or what other options that were excluded, that should be there or could be there. And those then immediately become questions about a kind of counter-activism or a kind of counter-algorithmic governance, and how we need computer scientists and coders to think about how what technologies do we require to make sense of the technologies that we currently can't make sense of because they operate below the threshold of our perception, which is, again, a question of pharmacology. It reminds me of the advert that Google put out for their Pixel Pro 6 camera. I mean, it's kind of in the name, isn't it? Pixel. I mean, it's a phone, it's a camera, right? And that advert promoted something called Real Tone, which was a feature that they claimed, and quote, would accurately photograph all skin tones, right? Which immediately reveals the problem, okay? But it also serves as this reminder of the kind of political and ethical dimensions of algorithmic governance, and the reality that algorithms always make the world in their own image. So I think we could talk about that for a long time, but those are just some thoughts, I guess, rather than an answer to your question.
I can say something about maybe education. I think that actually speaks to what Aris was saying in a way, with the problem of insurance. And certainly when we talk about LARPing, there's that idea that there's a level playing field, where we start. But that needs to be questioned with this idea of insurance. And in a way, I think maybe like specifically in this case, the person I was mentioning, Nabil Al-Kinani, who wrote this book, Privatized Amendment, the idea of ownership of land, you can read it in different ways. Like it might fall back under an older economic model where you're like, it's land for the sake of land, but you could think about it as a form of insurance for the possibility for this community to be able to, participate in that speculative space, which is quite literally the school that's functioning in that space. But for that to happen, you need to own the land. So this is kind of, in a way, it's more like, dealing with the process of acquiring insurance, let's say, for that space. But yeah, I think very kind of clearly the content of this project is speaking to education as a space that, speculation is dealing with. And the youth are, of course, they're severely affected by how the city is changing in these gentrified capitals. And they have a lot to say. I think they're very politicized already. So yeah, maybe I leave it here.
So I think David gave a great answer on the question of this algorithmic, counter-algorithmic, what do you call it, governance. Yeah. The only thing I would add there maybe is just if we look at the world of finance and how machine learning models and this kind of predictive big data AI is deployed in day-to-day trading. What's quite fascinating is that often this is internal uncertainty in that we don't know, and the traders themselves don't know how these models make money. So this creates all sorts of fascinating cultural kind of conflicts within the trading floor, which is not the floor, it's like screens everywhere, right? And what's interesting there is that you still need the kind of mythical, symbolic sort of storytelling to justify the gap of knowledge of not knowing how the models actually work and legitimate the work that you're doing as a human being. Sorry, that's just a story that I was reminded as you were talking. Just briefly on the question of the QAnon conspiracists, if they just believe-ish, but not really because they don't show up. I'm not sure because a lot more of them showed up on the Capitol when they attacked the in Washington when that took place, right? So I think I wouldn't discount the belief and the faith in that myth as just kind of abstract and immaterial. I think there is quite a strong conviction that is generated there.
Well, why weren't there more people to go and rescue the kids?
Yeah, I mean,
One guy.
yeah. Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is it's not always one guy, right? And then on the point of education, what I would say is that I don't see myself as developing a kind of paradigm or a kind of a program to be applied in an educational kind of space. I think I almost am doing the opposite. I quite opportunistically try to learn from my students on these questions. Like, I think there is something in this swarm-like politics of counter-speculation that we don't have the language and the lenses to apply and understand. And so the approach I take is trying to understand through observation, discussion, and immersion in the same spaces of what are the kind of toolkits that are being developed as we speak. It takes a little bit of optimism as well and a little bit of perseverance to consider something that is not readily identified as politics, to consider its political implications. But yeah, I hope I have sort of tried to kind of demonstrate a little bit with things like distraction, the distracted student on their phones, that's apathy. But is it apathy? Is this all they do? I think, there's something else, and that's something else that I want to understand. And but I will say, though, it's not. I think there is something about, a good old anarchist principle of being a flexibility in what modes of politics are available, and I don't think it's a either or. I don't think that a rejection of institutional party politics versus swarm-like politics of K-pop communities, it's not an either or. I think they can work hand in hand and reinforce each other rather than in conflict. And I guess that's something. If we're looking for takeaways, that's the one thing I would say with some certainty that. Yeah, it's definitely good to keep an open mind about these different avenues. Yeah.
We have a minute if you want to add a final comment. Otherwise, we can.
Maybe very quickly to Aris, because I've been meaning to say this with it's 4 months since the Iranian uprising/revolutions, and there's always, a shift in how social movements play out on social media platforms, and this time it's very much Instagram-based, like how the image, the representational aspect is really bold. And there was this essay an anonymous essay somebody wrote in Iran in the early days when women were posing, on the streets. Talking about the viralness of how, seeing yourself through the gaze of social media, not in that, there's that quality that's spreaded out. And the idea of seeing is actually kind of like turned around as, a political act. But then you can question, where does that lead us to? But something is unlocked in that moment anyways. Like there's a shift in how images circulate, especially with, under those conditions of gender apartheid.
I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you so much, Bahar, David, and Aris.